Today we examine the life and legacy of a largely forgotten scientist whose unorthodox ideas about electricity and gravity have made him the subject of much speculation and intrigue. Time to get connected on things visible and invisible. Paul, the last time we spoke, we were speaking about the mysterious figure, Townsend Brown, and things got even more mysterious. Your attempts to find out information from various US departments of state proved to draw a blank, even though you knew that you had information to the contrary. Leaving the 1930s aside for a moment, let's move to the Second World War and Townsend Brown's service in it. What did he do during the war years?
The United States was drawn into World War II with the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. And at the time, Townsend Brown was still working with the Navy and the Naval Research Labs and the radar school in Norfolk, Virginia, and was regarded as one of the Navy's top experts in radio and radar. So it is curious that come October of 1942, less than a year after the United States is drawn into the war, he parts company with the Navy under very questionable circumstances. Now, things have come to light in the last year or two that give us some reason to think that he had been ordered to move some of his experimental equipment from one facility, possibly at the University of Pennsylvania, where we have found some connections, to another naval facility. And rather than refuse the direct order to move that equipment to a place where he would lose control of it, he resigned from the Navy. So we have correspondence with the Navy from 1942 that shows one of the Navy's most valuable radar and radio experts leaving the Navy less than a year after the United States is drawn into World War II.
I mean,
by itself is a curious enough circumstance.
I was just going to...
Even more curious is that just a few weeks later, Townsend Brown shows up in Burbank, California, at a facility operated by the Vega branch of the Lockheed Aircraft Company, a facility in Burbank that's covered up with all kinds of camouflage so that it can't be seen from the sky. And he goes to work at the Vega Aircraft facility for reasons that become hard to discern. We don't know exactly what he's doing there. But it is worth noting that Vega was the kernel of Lockheed that eventually becomes the Skunk Works, which was Lockheed's top secret aviation facility during the 1950s and 60s. He disappears essentially in 1942 when he goes to work at Vega.
But the strange thing about this, Paul, I mean, strange to me, is that the US has just entered into a world war. You would imagine that these kind of naval researches that Townsend Brown is involved in are absolutely essential to the war effort. And somebody of his caliber as well, somebody with his background, would be sort of prized by the military. Do you think it was just a personality clash, or that he was slightly idiosyncratic and wanted to do his own thing? Or do you think there was something more lurking in the background? There's been various things said that perhaps he was on to something that the Navy didn't want him to find.
Well, to the contrary, I think he was probably on to things that the Navy did want him to find, but they were of a very highly classified nature.
Right.
There is another part of the story which goes back to the 1930s when Townsend Brown becomes part of what I could best describe as a private industrial intelligence network that we have called the Caroline Group, which gets its name from a yacht that was owned by the man who started the Victor Talking Machines Company and was part of a network of international intelligence operations that formed in the interregnum between World War I and World War II, at the behest or in cooperation with a man in Britain named William S. Stevenson, who would later go on to form British Security Coordination and become the man that Churchill dubbed Intrepid, who built the espionage networks that basically won World War II. So there's some affiliation between Eldridge Johnson from the Caroline and Stevenson, and Townsend Brown is brought into that network. So we are now dealing with what Linda Brown, his daughter, and I refer to as the deeper draft vessel behind all of this. So on the one hand, it's clear that he's working on some kind of classified projects under the auspices of the Vega Aircraft Company in Burbank, but it seems likely that he is also working on things that he has been developing privately under the auspices of this thing we're calling the Caroline Group, and there is some interface there. So there are layers of depths of blackness to all the things that are going on here.
Do you think there was a possibility of a kind of reverse deception going on here? I mean, the way in which he was sort of dismissed from the naval services and then he drifts off to California where he does things that we're not quite sure. Do you think there's any possibility that, given who he is and what we know of him, and certainly what you know of him, there's an element where he's constantly sort of blindsiding us?
This is true, but we're talking now about the period in the 1950s where, as I've written in the book, he's actually engaged in what seems to be a deliberate and conscious attempt to discredit himself. And the reason for that was, in the fall of 1950, after he has been working on these developments, primarily two things. Not only a propulsion device based on his earlier discoveries that I described with the snapping cables at Caltech, but he's also developed a communications system based on the same technological concepts. And the understanding that I have is that he demonstrated these two technologies for the Navy at Pearl Harbor in 1950. And that demonstration was compromised by an espionage network headed by a man named Kim Philby, who is notorious for having the Cambridge Five, which may be familiar to you, calling in from Britain, because that was part of the espionage networks that undermined MI6 in the 1940s and 50s. So Brown's work was compromised by that same network. But he had a way of diverting attention from what he had demonstrated in a way that made it look like nothing revolutionary, but very common but misinterpreted physical phenomena. So that's what we find him doing in the 1950s, is under the pretext of demonstrating something revolutionary, actually demonstrating something very commonplace and thus being dismissed as something of a quack or a charlatan because he's presenting these things as something that they are not.
Well, just on that, I mean, some of the references I've come across, just to get them out of the way, Philadelphia experiment, which most people will have heard of, you know, it's been in films and books. There was the famous book I think it was in the late 70s, the Philadelphia experiment, bestseller. And it kind of names Townsend Brown or certainly his research as the basis for the Philadelphia experiment. You mentioned Norfolk, Virginia, which I think is the place where this experiment took place, allegedly. Do you think there's any basis or any nexus between Townsend Brown and the Philadelphia experiment?
My contention is that what has entered the popular lore as the Philadelphia experiment, where attempts to achieve cloaking or invisibility caused a vessel to be magically transported from the Delaware River in Philadelphia and suddenly show up in its berth in Norfolk, Virginia, and that human bodies were fused into the hull as a result of this transmutation. My contention is that that never happened, and that any connection to Townsend Brown is another attempt to discredit him.
Yeah.
Now, he shows up in a book about the book that was written in the 1970s by an author named William Moore called The Philadelphia Experiment. There's a whole chapter about Townsend Brown in that book. And I think that's where the affiliation comes from. And I think that Brown actually approved that chapter because he wanted the discreditation that came from that affiliation. He was still trying to steer people away from the work that he was really doing.
Fascinating. Well, one thing we do know he was interested in very much was the whole UFO phenomena, which was very a la mode in the 1950s. What was his interest in that? Or is this, again, him playing with the general public, a sort of disinformation about who he is and what he's really up to?
I think it's both. I think that there's a case to make that when we begin talking about gravity control technologies, we are possibly looking at the kinds of technology that would propel interstellar craft if in fact they exist. We need the ability to cross great distances in short times. That would infer the ability to bend space to bring the destination closer. That would be consistent with Einstein's theories of relativity. So on the one hand, I think Townsend Brown was interested in UFO sightings to see if there was anything that he could learn about the technologies that, if those were in fact extraterrestrial craft, might have been using. So his curiosity is genuine, but his curiosity has the added benefit of associating him with a kind of a fringe culture which is treated as somewhat outside the scientific orthodoxy and to be viewed askance. So he gets a dual function there. On the one hand, he's trying to resolve his curiosity. On the other hand, he gets associated with a discredited community. But he did form an organization in the 1950s called NIKAP, which was the start over. He did form an organization in the 1950s called NIKAP, which was the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, and he was harvesting reports of UFO sightings using NIKAP. And NIKAP is its own curious story because there's associations with America's national intelligence establishment. One of the early presidents of NIKAP had affiliations with the CIA. So who knows what all was going on there. But yes, he was interested in UFOs, and that interest served a dual purpose.
Yeah, it's fascinating, this sort of double bluff that we've been talking about here throughout his career, in a sense. But then he at the height of all of this, or in the midst of all of this, he just disappears. What's the motivation for that, and what have you learned about where he went after that disappearance?
The story that I tell basically winds up around 1968. So he's got another 17 years left in his life. He died in 1985. And I don't go into the second half. It was hard enough to get that far because we're dealing with such thin sources of material. There has been speculation that some of the work that Townsend Brown did found its way into America's B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. And it's at the point where the technology that might have found its way into that aviation system was delivered that Townsend Brown begins to fade from the forefront. So that's kind of where I end the story. But he continued to be active in various other activities. It's just much more under the radar than it was even up to that point. And it was not very above the radar then. But we see affiliations between Townsend Brown and something called the Stanford Research Institute, which is associated with Stanford University, where the CIA had all kinds of contracts in what was called psychic spying or remote viewing. We don't know really if Brown was involved in any of that, but we do know that he continued to have an association with SRI into the 1970s, and then he basically retired to Catalina Island in around 1978.
And was his daughter able to shed any light on what was going on in her father's mind during these years?
His daughter, Linda, worked very closely with him in this period that I'm describing in the mid to late 1960s, when he's developing a version of his technology in the form of the fan precipitator, which eventually becomes the ionic breeze air purifier that we spoke about at the very beginning of our conversation previously. So they're developing this fan device, which has the ability to move air without any moving parts. It also serves as a very high fidelity loudspeaker, again, because there are no moving parts. That's the technology that they're developing throughout the 1960s, first on the East Coast and then later on the West Coast, under the auspices of an individual named Floyd Odlum, who had very close associations with America's aerospace and military establishment. And there's a demonstration for the RAND Corporation, which was one of the private research arms providing technology to the military. They demonstrate this fan device to the RAND Corporation in 1968. And then immediately after that demonstration, the project was shut down. Townsend tells Linda it's time to get on with her own life. And that's kind of the end of the story.
If you were to do an internet search on Townsend Brown, Paul, various words crop up. Charlatan, pseudoscience, all the usual stuff which I'm sure you've come across. But you've painted a slightly more intriguing picture than somebody who could be easily dismissed. But with all your researches and with all your study of his life, where do you sort of lie? Was he a genius, or was he somebody who is really just a fringe figure?
Oh, I think he was a genius. And I do think that he explored realms of science that continue to have merit and offer potential to this day. It is because the story is so wrapped in intrigue that it's hard to get a handle on the real merit of the science. But he wrote a couple of papers in the 1940s that I think the work that he was doing in communications in particular was based on. And I do think that that work has continued merit. And that's the theme that runs consistently through the work that I've done and the two stories that have intrigued me. With Brown, we're talking about means of propulsion, possible gravity control, and communications using similar technologies. And with Philo Farnsworth, it was his work in nuclear fusion in the 1960s that I think in both cases are areas of exploration that remain dormant that we need to wonder why don't get more attention.
Did the two men, did their paths ever cross?
Not to my knowledge. I do not believe they did. I would state categorically that they did not.
Fascinating. Paul, we've come to the end of this episode. It's been an absolute joy speaking to you as always. Is there a third mysterious scientist in the background you're working on at the moment?
I do not believe there is. Now, the way this system that you're looking at here works is something has to really grab my attention for me to put the time and effort into it. And that has happened to me twice with these two books, and it's happening with me now on a third project, which thankfully has nothing to do with lost technologies. I will say only that I am researching and will likely be writing a fictional biography of a deceased musician.
Fascinating.
Because, I live in Nashville and I've been part of the music business the whole time I've been here. So it's rather fitting that I bring whatever skill sets I learned telling these two nonfiction biographies to the prospect of turning a moment in history around and creating a fictional biography.
Well, sometimes fictional biographies can tell more truth than actual biographies, as we both know, Paul.
If you'll give me one more second, the thing about the Townsend Brown story is, in particular, is I've described it as living in the center of the Venn diagram between science, science fiction, and pseudoscience. So as we go through this whole narrative, you have to constantly be on the watch for where are we talking about science, where are we talking about science fiction, and where are we talking about pseudoscience, because they all weave in and out of that story.
Has Hollywood not come knocking on your door about either of these characters?
Hollywood has not come knocking yet, but there has been an option granted for the screen rights to The Man Who Mastered Gravity. It's not a direct Hollywood connection, but it's close. And that project is in the very early developmental stages by virtue of somebody having taken that option.
For now, Paul, tell people where they can find out more about you and pick up a copy of your various books.
The easiest way to find me on the web is going to be at ttbrown.com. All the other connections you can find from that website, or you can look me up on Amazon. Both books are available on Amazon here in the United States, on amazon.co.uk, and at any fine bookstore in your neighborhood, you can order it and get the physical copy.
Paul, thank you very much for coming on Things Visible and Invisible.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Things Visible and Invisible. We're dedicated to uncovering phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, from ancient enigmas and paranormal encounters to scientific anomalies and forgotten histories. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious and unexplained, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on future explorations. Have a personal experience or story that aligns with our investigations? We'd love to hear from you. Visit our website at tvi.show and reach out through our contact form. While we can't feature every submission, we review them all, and your story might be featured in an upcoming episode. To support our continued investigations, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member. Your contributions make these explorations possible and give you access to exclusive content, early releases, and monthly behind-the-scenes discussions with our team. Don't forget to check out our merch store. We've got everything from TVI-branded t-shirts and hoodies to stickers and coffee mugs, perfect for showing your support while keeping the mysteries close. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the things visible and invisible.